It all started with a knock so aggressive and so relentless that I genuinely thought someone was being chased by a bear, or maybe the Forest Service was coming to tell me the mountain was collapsing. But when I swung open the heavy oak door of my lake cabin, wiping sawdust from my palms on my worn-out Levi's, I wasn't staring at a grizzly or a ranger. I was staring into the cold, over-mascared eyes of Cynthia Sterling. Now, you have to understand that Cynthia wasn't an Oppos. Just some random hiker who'd lost her way. She was the iron-fisted president of the High Meadow Estates HOA back in the city, a woman who treated a slightly overgrown lawn like a felony and a non-approved mailbox color like an act of domestic terrorism. And yet, here she was standing on my private porch 45 miles outside her jurisdiction, clutching a gold-trimmed clipboard like it was a holy relic and glaring at me with the intensity of 1,000 suns. End quote. This is your final warning, Marcus, end quote. She snapped before I could even get A and Oppos. Hello and Oppos. Out of my mouth, her voice cutting through the peaceful morning air like a rusted saw blade, end quote. The noise violation from last night has been recorded, documented, and the board has authorized a $300 fine effective immediately, end quote. I just stood there, blinking against the bright sunlight reflecting off her oversized designer sunglasses, honestly wondering if I'd accidentally inhaled too much lacquer fumes while refinishing my deck, because the sheer absurdity of Cynthia Sterling standing in the middle of the deep woods to talk about neighborhood noise ordinances felt like a glitch in the Matrix. End quote, noise? What on earth are you talking about, Cynthia? And more importantly, how did you even find this place? End quote. I asked, my voice still trailing off in disbelief, but she just huffed, her nostrils flaring in that way that usually meant a neighbor was about to get a lien on their house, and she gestured wildly toward the lake. End quote. The music, the shouting, the blatant disregard for the quiet hours. We received multiple reports that you were hosting an unapproved gathering last night, and as a resident of High Meadow, your conduct remains under our purview regardless of where you decide to hide. End quote. I couldn't and Oppos. Help it. A short, sharp laugh escaped my throat, because it was just so quintessential Cynthia, this idea that her little suburban kingdom had no borders, and I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms as I looked at her beige luxury SUV parked crookedly on my gravel driveway. End quote. Cynthia, look around you. They're ISN and Oppos. A High Meadow street sign for 40 miles. There's no paved road, and my closest neighbor is a retired fisherman who's half-deaf and currently 5 miles downstream. End quote. I said, trying to keep my tone level, but failing to hide the smirk, end quote. This cabin is private property, it's unplatted land, and it's sure as hell ISN and Oppos. Part of your HOA, so you can take that fine and use it to start fire, because I'm not paying you a dime for playing some classic rock on my own porch in the middle of the wilderness. End quote. Her face turned a shade of purple I didn't know humans could achieve, and she jabbed a manicured finger toward my speakers, her voice rising to a screech that probably actually did disturb the local wildlife this time. End quote. It doesn't in Oppos. Matter where you are. You represent the standards of our community, and I will not have one of our residents behaving like a common hooligan simply because there are no streetlights to see by. If you refuse to settle this now, I'll involve the sheriff, and believe me, I have the logs to prove you were disturbing the peace. End quote. I told her as calmly as I could that she was currently trespassing on my land, and that if she didn't end Oppos, to get back in her crossover and drive back to the land of manicured hedges, I'd be the one calling the authorities, which sent her stomping back to her car in a fury of wedged sandals and indignation, leaving me alone with the silence of the pines and a very bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I figured that would be the end of the madness, just a momentary lapse in sanity from a woman who'd spent too many years sniffing power in a small pond. But I woke up the next morning to the crunch of gravel and the slow, rhythmic strobe of a light bar reflecting off my bedroom walls. I stepped outside to find a young deputy leaning against his cruiser, looking remarkably bored as he checked his watch, and when he saw me, he just gave a tired sort of nod. End quote. Morning, sir. Sorry to bother you so early, but we've had a caller. Oh, Mrs. Sterling, phoning dispatch every 30 minutes since dinner time yesterday claiming there's a massive riot. wildlife endangerment, and some kind of illegal festival happening at this coordinate, end quote. He said, rubbing his eyes while he looked around at the perfectly still lake and the empty, peaceful woods, end quote. I told her over the phone that this was outside any residential zone, but she insisted she was a and oppos, sworn officer of the community and oppos, and that I had a duty to intervene, end quote. I sighed, feeling a mix of pity for the deputy and genuine anger at Cynthia's persistence, and I explained the whole HOA situation to him while he took a few notes, his expression shifting from boredom to a faint, amused smile, end quote. Yeah, we got her flagged in the system now as a nuisance caller. Dispatch actually told her to stop calling 3 hours ago, but she started using a burner app to bypass the block, so I had to come out here just to verify there wasn't an oppos. An actual forest fire or something, end quote. He told me, shaking his head as he climbed back in his car, end quote. Just a word of advice, though. Women like that Don and oppos. Usually stop until they hit a wall, so you might want to brace yourself for. When you get back to town, end quote. He was an oppos. Joking, because when I pulled into my driveway in High Meadow Estates that Sunday evening, I found a bright orange, end quote. Notice of delinquency, end quote. Taped directly over my front door's peephole, and my inbox was flooded with emails from the HOA board about, end quote, moral turpitude, end quote, and, end quote, damage to the community's reputation, end quote. Cynthia had an oppos. Just doubled down. She'd gone nuclear, and by Monday morning I realized she had used the HOA's discretionary fund to hire a private security firm to, end quote, patrol, end quote, the sidewalk in front of my house, claiming I was a flight risk for unpaid fines. But what Cynthia Sterling didn't in oppos, realize, and this is the part where the story really takes a turn, is I'm not just a guy who likes his peace and quiet. I'm a senior land surveyor and a specialized consultant for the county's mapping and record department. I spend my days looking at the things people ignore. Easements, historical deeds, iron pipe markers buried 3 feet underground, and the exact legal definitions of where one person in oppos, as power ends and another in oppos, as begins. I spent that Monday night in my home office surrounded by stacks of yellowed survey plats and digital overlays that would make most people's eyes bleed, and as I traced the original 1974 development lines for High Meadow Estates, I found it a tiny, beautiful, catastrophic clerical error that had been sitting in the county archives for nearly 50 years, just waiting for someone like me to get angry enough to find it. See, Cynthia loved to talk about, end quote, the charter, end quote, this sacred document that gave her the power to fine us for our grass height. But when I pulled the original filing, I realized that the legal description for the HOA's boundary had been incorrectly transcribed from the master deed. The surveyor back in the 70s had missed a decimal point on the western boundary, and the way the document was officially ratified, the HOA only legally had jurisdiction over the first 3 phases of the neighborhood. And I lived in Phase 4, which meant that for the last 20 years, the High Meadow HOA had been illegally collecting dues and issuing fines to nearly 60 homes, including mine, without a shred of actual legal authority. I walked into the county clerk's office on Tuesday morning, feeling a level of adrenaline I hadn't into oppos. Felt since my college days, and I met with a woman named Sarah who'd worked the records desk for 30 years and had a, end quote, no HOA, end quote, sticker discreetly tucked under her desk blotter. When I showed her my findings and the overlay maps I'd prepared, she let out a low, slow whistle that sounded like a tea kettle hitting its boiling point. End quote. Marcus, if this is right, and knowing your work, it probably is, you're not just talking about a noise fine anymore, end quote. She whispered, her eyes wide as she flipped through the deeds, end quote. You're talking about 20 years of unauthorized taxation, fraudulent liens, and a complete collapse of their corporate structure. You're going to burn that woman's world down, aren't an oppos, end quote. I just smiled and asked for 3 certified, embossed copies of the corrected boundary map, telling her I wanted one for my lawyer, one for the sheriff, and one to hand-deliver to Cynthia during her precious, end quote, wink with tongue sticking out, residence end quote, on Wednesday afternoon. When I arrived at the community center for the meeting, the atmosphere was thick with that suffocating, artificial politeness that defined High Meadow, and Cynthia was sitting at the head of a long mahogany table, holding court for a group of intimidated board members and elderly residents. She saw me walk in and immediately stood up, her face twisting into that practiced mask of disappointment. End quote. Marcus, this is a private board session for members in good standing. Since you have outstanding fines and a pending disciplinary hearing, you're not permitted to address the chair, end quote, she said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that made my skin crawl. I didn't oppose T say a word. I just walked right up to her, ignored the gasp from the end quote, T committee, end quote, and slapped the certified county map directly on top of her clipboard. End quote. Actually, Cynthia, I'm not here as a member in good standing. I'm here as a private citizen who's been trespassing in your little club for a decade, end quote. I said, my voice projecting to the back of the room as everyone leaned in, end quote. Because according to the certified records of the county surveyor and the original 1974 master deed, Phase 4 is not, and has never been, part of the High Meadow HOA jurisdiction. You've been illegally fining me, harassing me at my private residence 40 miles away. And worst of all, you've been taking thousands of dollars in dues from me and my neighbors under false pretenses, end quote. The silence that followed was so heavy you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. And for the first time in the years I'd known her, Cynthia Sterling went completely ghost white pale, her hand trembling as she reached for her glasses to look at the embossed seal on the map. I didn't oppose. T stopped there, though, because I'd spent the last 48 hours doing more than just mapping. I've been talking to my friend at the sheriff's department, and it turned out that once you start looking into a person who thinks they're above the law, you find all sorts of interesting things. End quote. And while the county is looking into the fraud charges regarding the dues, end quote, I continued, looking directly at the other board members who were now staring at Cynthia like she was a ticking time bomb, end quote. They're also going to be very interested in the oppos, emergency landscaping and oppos, contracts you've been signing with your brother-in-law's firm using our community funds. Because it turns out that $300 noise fine you tried to give me was just the tip of the iceberg. Wasn't an oppos. T it? End quote. Cynthia tried to sputter out a defense, something about, end quote, administrative oversight, end quote, and end quote, protecting the aesthetic, end quote. But it was over. The dam had broken, and within 10 minutes, the meeting had devolved into a chaotic roar of angry neighbors demanding to know where their money had gone. The aftermath was like a slow-motion demolition derby. The HOA was hit with a massive class action lawsuit from the residents of Phase 4. The county opened a formal investigation into the embezzlement of the reserve funds, and Cynthia was forced to resign in disgrace before the sheriff finally showed up at her door with a warrant for wire fraud and criminal impersonation of an official. I went back to my cabin that weekend, sitting on the porch with a cold drink and listening to the wind in the trees, finally feeling the weight of the city lift off my shoulders for good. There were no knocks at the door, no orange notices, and no one telling me how high my grass should be or what music I was allowed to enjoy under the stars. The funny thing is, the neighborhood is actually better now that the end quote, rules end quote, are gone. People are talking to each other again. Steve from down the street finally painted his front door a bright, rebellious blue, and we all realized that a community ISN and oppos. T something you build with fines and clipboards. It's something that happens when you just let people be. But it makes me wonder, as I look out over the water, how many other people are out there right now paying fines to some tiny dictator because they haven into oppos. T check the decimal points on their deeds? Are we really, as in quote, governed in quote, as we think we are, or are we just one angry surveyor away from realizing the fences we live inside Don and oppos? T actually exist? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever stood up to a power-hungry board? Or do you think some rules are necessary, even if they're a bit over the line? Because in my experience, the only thing more dangerous than a woman with a clipboard is a man with a map and nothing left to lose.